Hello again, listeners. And you will notice that today's format is going to be a little different. That is because I will be both host and guest. So I'll be explaining a little bit about my current course. Our guest today is the brilliant Dr. Mark Shanahan. Mark is an expert on American politics, especially Eisenhower and the notorious Donald Trump himself. Our conversation details Biden, Trump's potential comeback, inflation, placing the current situation, which is engulfing America, in its proper historical context. And we hope that therefore this will provide an original and perhaps more positive discussion than you might think. Although I should say we will pull no punches either. Enjoy. All right, guys, so welcome back to the show. Delighted to have Mark with us here today. So it's the usual first question, Mark. Who are you and what do you do? I know we were chatting before and you gave us a cracking story about the weakest link. So over to you, Mark.
Right. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm Mark Shanahan. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations here at Reading. I'm slightly different from a lot of other people in my field in that I didn't get my PhD until I was 50 because I'd left university 20 odd years before even coming back into higher education to do my master's. I was one of those people who would sit at home and shout answers at quiz shows. My daughter got very fed up of me doing this and said, "Why don't you go on and do this yourself?" And she got an application form for me to do the weakest link. And I filled it in and I sent a picture of her because she was much nicer looking than me. They invited me to audition and I got onto the show, which I have to admit now, quite a few years on, I had only watched about twice at the time. And I went down to Pinewood. It's all recorded at Pinewood Studios, had a lovely afternoon and won it. And walked out with £2,700 in my pocket at the end of the day. So I thought that was quite nice. And I got grabbed by one of the producers on the way out. And she said, "We're actually recruiting for some other quiz shows on the BBC. Would you be interested?" And I said, "Oh, well, what might that be?" And she said, "Mastermind." And full of bravado and thinking I was quite clever because I'd won the weakest link and I knew that a guppy was a small fish, which I think was about the standard of the questions there. I also got onto the show, had to go and sit in the great black leather chair. It was recorded up in Manchester and I managed to forget my shoes on the way. So for anyone who's ever seen that episode, I'm in a very nice shirt that goes with the suit, but I'm not wearing the suit because all I had was my scruffy old trainers and my jeans. So I'm mismatched, uncomfortable, sitting in the chair, supposedly answering questions on the life and works of Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, the man who put Sputnik into space and Yuri Gagarin and all of those great things. And I learned everything about what he did in his career, but kind of forgot about the life. And so I came last and I was beaten by a man in a shiny suit and a bad wig answering questions on Frank Sinatra. But what I found out is I loved research. So I popped along to my local university, thinking I was going on to find out about evening courses, but they don't do evening courses because they're a university. So I came out, signed up for a master's and loved it. Really enjoyed doing my master's in international relations. I was midway through my dissertation when my supervisor said, "This actually feels a bit more like PhD work. If you'd like to do a PhD, I will be happy to supervise you." So I was very, very lucky. I was 45 at the time, did my PhD in political history, graduated from that when I was 50, and I'd started teaching at Reading midway through my PhD back in 2012. And they've not been able to get rid of me since.
That's a fantastic story. I quite like the curious imagery of you winning the weakest link and then becoming last in Mastermind. Sort of.
Oh yeah, I needed to be brought back down.
But absolutely, I guess with research as well, you can decide what you want to do rather than someone giving you questions about the life of someone you've been researching. It's the bit that fascinates you that you can focus on.
Yes, absolutely true. And in fact, I started working on the impact that the media had on Kennedy's decision to send men to the moon. So following on in the same area, got my first research trip overseas, went over to the Kennedy Library near Boston, and found out that the media had absolutely no impact on his decision to send men to the moon. Unfortunately, this was 18 months into my PhD study, so there was a quick change of direction. And I actually found out that some guy called Eisenhower was far more interesting, and I've stuck with him ever since.
Oh, brilliant. And that works well with the topic of the podcast today, American politics, that we're going to be discussing. But we've also got another expert, if you will, in the shape of Chris, who's been studying an MA public policy over the last, what's it been, about 9 months now, Chris? You've been studying that at Reading. So yeah, could you tell us a little bit about the course and what modules you have covered so far?
The story's not going to be as fascinating as Mark's, but nonetheless, what brought me to go and study a master's at Reading is, again, I've always found the current world fascinating, politics fascinating, countries like the United States, Russia, China, all of that, and the way these great nations interact. So in the end, I went for an MA in public policy. I chose public policy because, one, obviously I thought it would work quite well in terms of future career direction, but also secondly, I quite like the fact that as a part of public policy, you also study how the various political and economic systems actually work. Economics is something, maths I've always been terrible at, but fortunately, I actually learned that the study of economics isn't necessarily so maths dominated. It's more complex in terms of the various theories which you learn, and the guidance has been very good. So the way it works is that because I'm studying public policy, there's first of all the politics on half, and then there's economics on the other half. Now, some universities, that would be, if you want, the nuts and bolts in terms of everything you'd go and study. The thing which I really liked about Reading was they offered you that flexibility in terms of studying other things as well. So on top of that, I've had the opportunity to do qualitative research, which has been quite important for things such as dissertation design. I did strategic studies too, so the strategy of war from ancient times into the classical times into the modern era and how that's impacted modern warfare. And then in this term, I'll be looking at international security, which obviously is extremely relevant at the moment, and then also contemporary diplomacy. And so I guess everyone would always think of diplomacy as being this really nice business where everyone gets on. But in fact, there is much more of a coercive element to it as well. And so it's a really fascinating, world where, of course, countries try and work together, but they're also, of course, competing with each other in the world of diplomacy. So if you like, I guess, understanding how the world really works, looking at the theory and then the practical and then the way those two interrelate, I think a master's in public policy or any kinds of politics such as international relations is something which is definitely worth exploring.
So Chris, I came back into my master's when I did it after quite a long time in the workplace, and I did my master's in international relations. You've had a few years working now. What surprised you most about being a student again?
First of all, I was expecting to have a whole heap of time, to myself. And you do get that independent time, but I think the intensity of the course is something which surprised me in a positive way. I think the master's course is what you make of it. At undergrad, you'll be a bit more guided for each step. And at master's, you do get that guidance, but if you don't do the reading each week, then you're not going to get the most out of the course. Second thing, probably which surprised me a lot more, was I did used to be a teacher in a previous life, and at that point the teacher's always the one who tries to go and guide the discussion. But being in a room, and at particularly at master's level, where you're going to get academics and they will make you lead the discussion, quite like that element of personal responsibility too. So I think that's it. When you're the masters, you have complete and utter ownership. And obviously for some people, I think that can be something which is more of a challenge, but I think if you embrace it, it's something which is more of the positive. And the last thing which I should say is, although I've mentioned the intensity, one thing which I've loved as a student as well is just that extra hour sleep. It's very nice. I will regret having to give that up next year when I go back into the world of works.
Absolutely. I remember talking to you, Chris, and you saying, I don't know what the big, fuss is about. Sometimes I'd be working a lot harder at work than and getting up earlier and stuff like that. But I guess it's that balance of you're constantly reading and doing something that you're really passionate about and constantly engaged with it. So it probably feels less of a chore, I would imagine, than work does sometimes.
Yeah, I think you're actually spot on about that. It may have been the same for you as well, Mark. But one reason why I did it was I realised that I was always consistently watching and reading things about all of these topics anyway. So I'd say half of it doesn't necessarily feel like work. And again, one benefit which you do have is really quite an interesting book about a moment about Henry Kissinger. And there was quite a few things I could bring about that into my contemporary diplomacy essay. So even though you're reading things which might feel like they're not work dependent, if you've got that passion and you've got that wider focus, it will all translate quite nicely into the work itself.
Yeah, I mean, two things I would say on that as well. One thing I found, and I love it when I'm teaching at master's level, is the internationality of the cohorts that we have, that you're working with people literally from around the world, pretty much from every continent, although I don't think we've yet got anyone from Antarctica, but just about everywhere else we have covered. So you're always working with a really interesting group who have wide perspectives to bring to any of the issues that we look at. And I think the other thing I would say is we don't teach current affairs. It's not a degree in current affairs at all, but affairs that are current play into just about every module that you would study at master's level. And having that interest and having that knowledge, this gives you a forum to bring those to bear. And they're going to stand you in really, really good stead when you go back into the world of work afterwards.
Absolutely. And talking to Chris, he said obviously situation in Ukraine has been discussed a lot in classes, and also in light of kind of the subject of this podcast, talking about American politics. Chris, could you tell us a bit about how your course has touched on American politics as well?
In terms of where it touches over, I've noticed on all of my modules. So if, for example, you're looking at the political systems of a democracy, that is one thing which is quite interesting, because the American system is obviously hugely influential in terms of history, but also its current structure. And so I think, first of all, that's something which has been incredibly useful, particularly in the present time, to look at and study the American system, presidential system, of course, and see how it compares to our own systems as well. Obviously, if you're looking in the world of diplomacy, Western point still, if you want, the kind of leading country. And so if you're studying global politics, you're studying diplomacy, you're studying things such as military mystery, you can never really escape America. It's always there in the modern context. And even if you're looking at something such as, strategy, again, lots of quite influential American figures. So I think one thing, just if you want to be a little bit more precise, one module which I was doing, which was quite interesting, is diplomacy. And there's something called CD, otherwise known as Coercive Diplomacy. Before I studied this, and this is a good example where masters can really quite change your thinking, I'd never really considered it. But, coercive diplomacy, and particularly nuclear age, it's all about how countries try and coerce each other through diplomatic means. Understanding about how America has led on this kind of diplomacy, how the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good, neat case study of where it all began, and how the theory went and blossomed from there, and how it's been American presidents and American administrations who've led on this form of diplomacy. The short answer is, Phil, is that America is everywhere and it's ever present, as you would expect.
It's really useful to get your insight into how the course is running, and then Mark is the head of department. And so I think we'll now go through a number of questions just touching upon American politics. I think, Chris, you've got the first one there to go with for Mark.
Sure. So, Mark, in the volatile world, or seemingly volatile world of American presidency, Joe Biden's administration has arguably been dogged by momentous events and then also missteps or misquotes, including very recently an offhand comment about the future of a certain Vladimir Putin. Do you think he's going to be a one-term president?
Good question. I am going to stick up for Joe Biden, but I'm going to say yes, he is likely to be a one-term president. So sticking up for him so far, he inherited the presidency at an unprecedented time. So taking over as president in the midst of a pandemic, when the previous administration under Donald Trump had dealt incredibly poorly with the pandemic, was never going to do Biden any favors. He's had to put a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time and a huge amount of political capital into the recovery of the United States. And he's not got a very good press for it, partly because he is not the best media performer. Unlike Donald Trump, who arrived in our living rooms every Saturday night for 15 years with the "you're fired," although he said it with an American accent, Biden isn't the same. He's not that television almost caricature that we got to know with Trump. But what he's done is help the economy recover at a faster rate than anybody expected. 93% of the jobs that were lost across the pandemic are now back in the American economy. They are putting on more jobs per month than at any time under the previous president. And the economy is in pretty good shape. He's got a problem with inflation, and maybe we'll come back and touch on that later on. But Biden is not doing badly. Now, we look at him from an international perspective, largely by the foreign policy that was delivered in relation to Afghanistan, where last summer he pulled out of Afghanistan, didn't really involve his international allies in the decision making, and left the country in a pretty poor state from which it really hasn't recovered. And there is a crisis in Afghanistan that we're not really seeing now because it's been buried under the appalling crisis in Ukraine. And it would seem that in media terms, we can't cope with more than one crisis in the world at any one time. Biden did exactly what he said he was going to do during the campaign. He picked up a policy that had been set in play by Trump that said America was going to withdraw from Afghanistan, to bring the troops home, because this is what the American people wanted. And actually, I was in the States just before Christmas, and if you ask people over there, was Afghanistan a bad decision to make? They'll say no. They'll say he did exactly the right thing. We wanted our troops home. America should not be getting involved in unwinnable wars. It will be interesting to see what role Biden plays in the ongoing awful war that's happening in Ukraine at the moment, and whether America steps up its efforts in a more meaningful way there. But his presidency is not as bad as it's painted. We're in a hyper-partisan time within American politics now, where everything that the Democrats do is wrong in the eyes of Republicans. And as Republicans make up just about half of the country, it means we have a terribly fractured and terribly split country. You have media that doesn't have to be impartial. So you get the partiality on one side of MSNBC, who will cheer for the Democrats. On the other side, it's Fox. And Fox are loud. They make a lot of noise. People like Tucker Carlson, the well-known commentator masquerading as a news anchor, make big political pronouncements. And if he has decided that Biden is not the man for America, he will be very, very, very forceful and forthright in making that position clear. And Biden hasn't helped himself because he is an older man who is not always absolutely clear in what he's trying to say. The comments he made about Putin is a really interesting one, because he probably said what everybody in the Western world was thinking. But Chris, as you would know, studying diplomacy this year, you don't say those things in diplomatic circles. You think them, you let the media, you let people around you articulate them, but you don't give the other side a free shot. And that is pretty much what he did with that comment on Putin.
That's really interesting. I think just to pick up on what the last bit of what you were saying, I was watching an interview on CNN quite recently with the former oligarch Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and his view was that Biden saying that wasn't a misstep, and he called I think both that comment by Biden, and also in terms of his comments of saying if there was use of chemical weapons in Ukraine, that there would be reaction that was on a similar level, or something to that effect. He thought that was actually the right way to approach things, because he sees Putin as someone who only understands strength, and as soon as you back down in any way, he just takes advantage of you. And he saw that as what had happened with Macron, for example. I mentioned this to Chris before the episode, and he was saying, yeah, but Mikhail Khodorkovsky is a little bit of a shady character himself. I wonder what your opinion on that would be, of that you're dealing with Putin as someone who only aggression is going to be understood, and any diplomacy will be seen as weakness.
I find it absolutely fascinating. Something came up on my Facebook this morning that showed I was in Moscow 3 years ago today. And I was doing some lecturing over at a university, and I remember I was being driven back from that university into the centre of Moscow, and suddenly the traffic just came to a complete and utter halt. Nobody moved in any direction, and I speak about 3 words of Russian. My driver didn't speak a whole lot of English, but he's just enough for him to say it's Putin's convoy, he's leaving the Kremlin. And essentially, when Putin decides that he is on the move, Russia comes to a halt to accommodate him. So the boulevards of Moscow are cleared so that Putin's cavalcade can drive out and around the streets to wherever he is going. I've never been in a city where I've seen so many police, and that's just the visible ones. So literally on every corner, if there isn't a statue of Pushkin, there is most certainly a small group of uniformed police. There are many, many different kinds of police. There are lots and lots of tentacles that lead back to a Russian leader who rules through fear, who has established a system of government where he and only he makes the decisions that matter. And it is a rule by fear. So in order for any American leader, any Western leader to have any cut through, they have to get beyond that fear. The Russian media is totally enthralled to Putin and will just put out exactly what he says and in the way that he wants it, and won't cover most of what is actually happening in Ukraine. The Americans know that and actually have to be quite smart to get around it. I have quite a few Russian former students who I'm in contact with at the moment, and it is really interesting to talk to them and find out where they're getting their news from. They certainly heard what Joe Biden said, and I think very much in terms, as you would put it, he said those things to be heard in Russia. It made the White House panic, because the White House and the State Department run on the rails of normal diplomatic rules. Maybe Joe Biden is a little bit smarter. I actually think the Putin comment was slightly more happenstance than overly planned. I think he was thinking it and had had a very good 27-minute speech and therefore carried on into it. But these messages have to get out. They have to get out quite clearly. They will be heard by Putin. And you are right. Putin understands force and needs to see that there is equal strength ranged against him, or even more strength ranged against him than he can muster himself. And he will not back down until that happens. There's no guarantee he will back down at all. But if we acquiesce to any of his wishes, he's not going to stop.
Yeah, I think I probably would agree with much of what you said there. I think Biden has had a little bit of history throughout his political career of being quite, colourful and being a little bit more offhand. But I guess the reason why it could potentially be dangerous is the fact that we get used to the fact that in the West, if somebody asks for, governmental change, that's not a matter of life and death for the government. But in somewhere like Russia, with a heavy personalized repressive rule, regime change is if you want a national security threat on quite a high level. So that's why I suppose you wouldn't necessarily want the message to be poorly received. If the Russians take it that way, I'm probably a little bit more suspect to the idea that the Putin's regime are quite canny and they'll read it in a certain way and they'll try and make use of a comment like that. But it might not necessarily change their tack so much. But did you think, despite all that, which is Biden in a way was just being honest, because do you think there is a tactic in the West right at the moment, if you look at what many politicians say, including Boris Johnson, when he actually spoke in Russian right at the start of the invasion, and he said, essentially, we don't blame the Russian people for this, but we hold the leadership accountable. Do you think that this is something, even if they're not meant to say it explicitly, but it's part of the tactic, which is you try and drive a wedge between the Russian people and the leadership as far as possible?
I think we're seeing it quite a lot. We're seeing this being described as Putin's war. And that works on both the front of America as an international leader, and it is the attempt to drive the wedge. I don't think there will be any popular uprising. There will be no velvet revolution happening in Russia. For one thing, Putin wouldn't enable it to happen, wouldn't let it happen. He would put it down very, very harshly. But secondly, he still has the support of a good third to a half of the population. But don't forget, Biden was also speaking for an American audience. And the other side of the aisles in America, on the Republican benches in Congress and down in some of the nice southern Floridian climes around Mar-a-Lago, there are people who have been either actively or tacitly supporting, particularly at the very beginnings of the Ukraine war, the stance of Putin. There is conjecture that there is still a relationship in some ways between Trump and Putin, and Trump was not the quickest off the blocks to come out and condemn this invasion of Ukraine. So the message was also going out to voters who will be getting ready to vote in the midterms in America in November, that maybe you should look at your own politicians, look at the Republican politicians particularly, and their stance on this. Do they see this as Putin's war? Where do they stand in relation to Putin? How many of them have taken favors from the Russian government in the past? So Biden is also playing a canny political game. I still go back to what I said right at the beginning. I don't think he is likely to be a two-term president, but clearly he wants a Democrat to succeed him in the White House in 2024. And one of the steps he has to put in place in order for that to happen is for the Democrats to have a decent midterm election this time round, which wasn't looking so good until recently, but the economy is turning around, and certainly the next few months and how he deals with Ukraine and with the foreign policy challenges that throws him will be vital in positioning the Democrats for those midterm elections.
It's fascinating, and that actually goes quite well into our next question, which is about Donald Trump. So he's refused so far to confirm whether he will run for president in 2024. But do you think he will run for that, and can he actually win again?
Well, of course, I would point you to The Trump Presidency, From Campaign Trail to the World Stage, an excellent book edited by our own history associate professor Mara Oliver, with some bloke called Mark Shanahan. Don't know who he is. I hear he's quite good, though. That came out in the first couple of years of the Trump presidency. And we attempted through that to define just who Trump is as a politician. And some of the things that came out of there is that Trump loves power, but didn't particularly like the job. He liked being president, but not necessarily having to make the decisions and deal with the day-to-day. He likes very much the idea of being the candidate in 2024, but won't necessarily be the candidate at all in 2024. The law might have caught up with him by then. There are so many lawsuits that are swimming around that involve him. There's the emolument clause, which means that you can't make money out of a presidency. And there are a number of different investigative bodies looking at that to see whether he flouted the law during his time in office. We all know the January the 6th events from last year. Was it an insurrection? What role did he play in that? Again, the House investigation that is going on at the moment. I was talking to Elaine Luria, the Democrat Congresswoman from Virginia, who is part of that panel. I was talking to her back in November. She's saying that they didn't think results would be quick, but that they would find their way to the bottom of the issues of January the 6th. And it is unlikely that Donald J. Trump, 45th president, is going to come out smelling of roses. But we have seen what he's been like. A man is made of some combination of Teflon and rubber, and he just bounces back time and again. He has a huge charisma. He has a big hold over the Republican Party. It's difficult to see, if he chooses to run, who could actually beat him in the Republican primaries. Mike Pence came out with a 28-page document last week setting his stall out, but his stall sounds very much like a Trump light. And it looks as though Pence will only be at the forefront if Trump's not there. If neither of those are there, who are we looking at? Nikki Haley, maybe, one or two others. Josh Hawley, maybe he will come through. But there are no big, strong front runners. Trump, in his mind, would like to run. I'm not sure the party is entirely behind him. He's also going to be quite a few years older. If he looks at Biden, maybe he'll see that frailties are likely to catch up with him. He would be an 80-year-old president. Has he still got the energy? Not entirely sure. But I think the likelihood is that if the law doesn't do for him first, he will be the front runner for the Republicans in 2024.
Okay, and I guess, Mark, based upon everything which you've just said, what does it say about the American political system, or where politics in America is currently at if Trump wins again? Is he, if you want, a symptom of a diseased political system? Is that fair to say, or people have suggested that line of thinking before?
I'm reading a book at the moment by Sarah Churchwell, which I will have to look at the cover of to see. It's called Behold America. And it's about the whole idea of America first, 100 years ago. So it looks at the presidency of Warren Harding back in the 1920s and the whole period around that. And what strikes me is the American political situation then, back in the 1920s, actually during the boom years under Calvin Coolidge, is not that different from today. So we still have very, very divided two-party politics. They have the first past the post system, same as we do. It's very difficult for third parties to break through. It's very difficult to have any consensus in politics. And we haven't really had the kind of reaching across the aisle, working for the good of the whole of America, probably actually since Eisenhower was president, greatest president ever, I should say. But there again, I write the books about him, so I would say that, wouldn't I? We have had the two parties diverging hugely. If you look at it over the last 20 years with the rise of the Tea Party, that feeling of, particularly of white rural America, feeling left behind, you've had them grabbing the Republican Party and taking it to the right. You've had the ever-growing influence of the rural evangelical churches, the Protestant churches. who have brought a wave of social conservatism back to the Republicans, so that we see it now in challenges to voting rights. We see it in challenges to Roe versus Wade, so the right for a woman to have control over her body. All of these things are coming out and coming into play. The Democrats have not moved so much in a progressive direction towards the left. Okay, we see the rise of AOC and the Squad, but it hasn't had quite the impact on the Democrats, who are still fairly centrist, many of whom would translate in the UK to be very happy members of the Conservative Party. But what we've had is the right go a long way right, fueled by the media. Where this leaves American politics is in a hyper-partisan mess, so that now we don't get the two sides coming together for the benefit of the country as a whole, but that we get each side opposing anything that the other suggests. And with Trump, that will just be more oil on the fire rather than trying to douse those fires. If he's up against Biden, it is a really bad result for both sides, because it means that there is no new, fresh, more enlightened talent coming through. And that's where the problem really lies in American politics at the moment, is that the next generation are just not as strong, as well known, as effective in their ability to raise funds as the old stages. And until those old stages die off, we really don't know what the future for American politics is.
Just quickly, based upon two things which you were saying, the challenge in terms of the next talent pool emerging, and then also the media in America. How culpable do you think we should hold institutions like CNN, Fox? There's a brilliant show called Succession about where it takes a spoof, if you want, of the kind of Fox version. Do you think that the trouble is that in such a partisan, heated atmosphere, A, it puts talented people off from going into politics, and then B, because it's so divisive, it keeps potential talents down? Or is it much more complex than saying this goes well beyond, that kind of media lens?
Yeah, it's not a straightforward binary by any means, but a lot of very good political figures have got out of politics in the last 10 or 15 years rather than run. I mean, we could have had President Al Gore, we could have had President Paul Ryan. You might not like either of those, but they were both big political figures who chose to lay down the mantle and move on. And they're just two of many. In America, ever since Ronald Reagan, we have not had to have impartiality in broadcast journalism. So essentially, journalism happens in order to get as many advertisers as possible onto your channel to pay large amounts of money that are going to deliver stockholder benefits. So the whole idea of news in America is to get as many viewers as you can, so that you're going to put money into the pockets of the shareholders of NBC or whoever it may be. It doesn't necessarily make for good news. It doesn't make for good political coverage. But the politicians play to those grandstanding echo chambers. What you tend to get less and less now is the attempt to unify and to reach across the aisles and go for that middle ground, despite the fact that most American voters are not party affiliated, are independents, and are in the ground to be played for. But we're in an era where at the top level, and this happens at state level and certainly at federal level, politics is about personality. It's about the celebritization of politics rather than the propagation of effective policy. And the media and the way it turns American politics into entertainment is hugely culpable in that.
Yeah, quite depressing analysis there, but I think it's spot on. Phil, before we go on to the American dominance in the world stage and all of that, do you have a question?
Maybe quite a broad question to throw in at this stage, but while you were kind of talking about American society, it got me thinking about a video Chris sent recently to me about Russian society and how we can understand why it can seem so different to other societies, and then obviously what you were describing there in America seemed in some ways quite alien to our society. What's your opinion? It is quite a big question, but how much can you understand politics in terms of the society of the countries they're in?
There's a huge interplay between politics and society. Each one influences the other. I set a question for some of my students this year, which asked them, to what extent is the American system of government the best system that money can buy? And I get some really, really interesting answers. And I guess where it comes from in my mind is that you have got the most hyper commercial society in the West. It's probably challenged by places like Japan and Korea in the East. But you have a society that is hugely capitalist, where the interpretation of the American dream today is massively materialistic. It's about owning property. It's about owning the beautiful cars, the lovely beach condo with the boat parked alongside it. But that's not a modern phenomenon. That has been around probably for 100 years now. And when you have a society that focuses on the betterment of the individual through that individual's efforts and rewards that kind of success with huge laudatory praise. So in America, it's not where you're from, it's what you're worth. And that really does influence the way it deals with its politics. So generally, the people who raise the most money in their campaigns win. Generally, the ones who get the biggest, most powerful backers on board win. And those big and powerful backers want something for their backing. So you have a transactional series of events that go to make up American politics. There is not a huge amount of really good congressional law made. There are lots of small laws. If you want a National Catfish Day and you're the catfish of Mississippi lobby, don't worry, we'll find a politician for you that will make that happen. And seriously, there is a National Catfish Day. It's in June. I look forward to celebrating. And the guy who introduced the bill for National Catfish Day became the Agriculture Secretary. It's amazing how these things go. But you end up with this idea that if you pump in enough money and enough effort, you will get results, no matter whether it is for the overall benefit of the country or any part of the country or not. And that transactional nature makes people quite cynical. Politicians are among the least trusted people in America. They're down there below journalists, somewhere near real estate agents. Probably none of them would be on my chosen table for dinner most of the time.
Okay. Winners and losers, and interesting themes in there, such as I think that notion of American individualism, and if you compare it to a system such as in Asia with China, it's much more of a collectivist society. And one of the interesting clashes which we'll see in the next 20 years is seeing which system is going to either maintain its primacy or indeed usurp the other one. So do you think, Mark, that over the next 20 years we're going to see the end to this unipolar world, the end to, if you want, America being the dominant state?
I actually think we will see the end of the unipolarity, but I don't see it as a doom-slaying scenario. The unipolarity was always likely to happen after the Second World War, where you only had one economic victor, which was the United States. And funny enough, they got to set up the system, be it the United Nations, the World Bank, all of those key institutions that come out of the Bretton Woods agreements. Favour America and favour American commerce and favour the McDonaldization of the world. America itself is withdrawing to some extent from that role that it set up for itself. It doesn't want to be the cavalry when it comes to every dispute around the world. It doesn't want to get involved in every economic decision around the world. It would like to do it through soft power, the McDonaldization of the world. Wherever you are in the world, you're probably no more than 8 feet away from a rat or 200 feet from a Walmart. And that's kind of the way that America would like to rule the world in future. China will rise. China is rising. You look at the Belt and Road Initiative and all of the other areas in which China is pushing its power well beyond its own borders. We are in a bipolar world, whether you like it or not now. China will have a lot of influence, certainly south of the equator, and I suspect with the decline of Russia over the next few years and the demise, I am sure, that will happen of the current Russian regime, China is going to fill that vacuum as well. It need not necessarily be an awful thing unless you have a very red, white and blue, stars and stripes view of the world. It will be different, absolutely. America will lose in relative power, but it will remain hugely powerful. And I suspect what we will see is outside its own shores, China will act in a rather more westernized, perhaps even aping Americanized manner. It will still be a pretty repressive regime within its own borders, but it can't export that part of its culture to the rest of the world.
Brings us on to our next question. You mentioned earlier that inflation looks like it might be an increasing problem for the US and the West in general. So, Mark, how concerned should we be about this, in your opinion?
It's a tricky one because it's not something the president can particularly fix. He's getting a lot of blame at the moment for the highest inflation figures in the United States for the last 30 years. But we look across the world and inflation is high. It has cost a huge amount of money to keep the economic system moving during the pandemic, and that comes at a cost. Biden pretty much frittered around the edges for the first year of his presidency, looking at supply side and seeing whether there was anything he could do. But a lot of it isn't really his fault and probably comes down to the Federal Reserve, so the American equivalent of the Bank of England, maybe not putting the brakes on measures that they took to keep the American economy moving during the pandemic. What happened when they removed the benefits for a lot of Americans? Suddenly prices started rocketing. You also have a lot of oil companies, and the fossil fuel industry is very powerful in American politics, who are making massive amounts of money. And they're not turning around and they're not seeing any regulation that says we will need to curb our profits. So rather like in the UK, there's no windfall tax happening over there. So actually, some of the big corporates who've done reasonably well through the pandemic are now doing exceedingly well, and the consumer is suffering from it. What Biden and most of America hoped for was that inflation was going to be transitory, but COVID is still with us. It's taking a while for the economy to come back, even though jobs in America in particular are coming back and coming back quickly. But he is very limited in what he can do to deal with this inflation. Now, last week, he opened up the oil reserves. So he's putting millions more barrels of oil per day into the system, which is bringing prices down. But unless fuel companies in particular act in consumers' benefits, and if it happens in the US, it will happen in the UK and in Europe. Those prices are going to remain high. And while the war is on, obviously, there is an even greater threat to them. places like Saudi Arabia have not been quick in recovering their ability to put oil into the system. They've been hard hit also by the pandemic. There are fewer people working in the industry. They are actually having to recruit oil workers at the moment. So it's a global situation that America can only have a limited impact on. And America will act in its own interests first. That America First slogan that we heard a lot of under Trump has not gone away. And if Biden is having to balance the interests of his own country going into election season with not totally losing the goodwill of large corporates who play a very important part in American politics. If they all feel that they are going to get a far better deal out of the Republicans, there will be a lot of funding going into non-Democrat candidates. And that will have an effect that will ripple out from America through the rest of the Western world and into East Asia very early in 2023.
I think what you outlined quite interestingly there, Mark, is actually we often think from the outside the president is this huge all-consuming power, but actually in such a complex system there's often a limitation upon what the president alone can achieve. So America seemingly is on a bit of a downward spiral, and we were interested in knowing your thoughts in terms of what you think is the essential thing that it must do. And if you think that people are over-egging the downward spiral, do feel free to challenge that.
Let me challenge that downward spiral. I don't think America is necessarily on a downward spiral. I think it has problems within its own internal politics. And relatively, as we've said, the likes of China and India are emerging and becoming more powerful and more of a challenge to American hegemony. It is still by far the largest and most coordinated economy in the world. It has that economic power that no other country can match. It is in charge of the levers such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, even though one of them will always have a European leader. But these are institutions set up by America that America benefits from. The United Nations still largely works to America's tune, even though it might like to think otherwise. But I do have a slightly cynical view of that particular organization. America has to get its own house in order. It needs to get beyond this rather silly name calling that happens across the aisle. It needs to get away from the Lauren Boeberts and Marjorie Taylor Greens, who make for interesting copy in newspapers, but don't move the political future of the country forward by a single iota. If America can get serious about its own politics, then its position in the world really isn't going to be challenged. It may have to live with other systems, particularly the Indian system of nationalist-based democracy and China's far greater collectivism. What we're seeing is fairly strong autocratic shifts in the geopolitical tectonic plates. But it's not gone yet. America has been around since 1776, and I don't see them disappearing into either of the shining seas that border them any time soon.
I'll be interested, again, as a final time, put this back to Mark. The extent of this divide in American politics, to me, it seems so stark and almost impossible to heal, and I'm not naive enough to think that it necessarily is ever going to be fully healed. It's always had that feeling of division. When I listened to Noam Chomsky, he was speaking about it, and he said it's the worst he's ever experienced. So one potential way to address, I think, would just to it's always going to be a two-party system, but for both parties to try and find a way for a better caliber of leadership to come through. Mark, you mentioned Eisenhower, who of course was an incredibly impressive individual. After that, you had the Kennedy administration. Lyndon Johnson gets a rough time, but if you look at his domestic politics, again, very impressive. Point is you have this contour of impressive caliber in terms of leadership. I personally think Obama was quite an interesting and impressive thinker too. But perhaps if you look at, George Bush Jr. before him and then who came after him, and perhaps that kind of impressive leadership was just a blip. So there's 2 points there, which I'd be interested to get, Mark, your thoughts on, which is the divide in America the worst it's ever been? And then secondly, I think you mentioned it before, but how do we get the correct people coming into leadership again?
There is definitely a huge divide in American politics, and the rift seems to have widened. Again, this is nothing particularly new. We have seen it in waves, as you said, across the last 150 years. I remember when Chomsky came to Reading a few years ago, and I got my 2 minutes with the man, which 2 of the best minutes of my life there. He was kind enough to ask me what I was doing. I said I was writing a book on Eisenhower at the time, and he goes, do you know, and this was during the 2016 presidential campaign, he goes, do you know, Eisenhower's policy platform in 1952 is pretty much identical to Bernie Sanders. And that really struck me at the time because, of course, Eisenhower was running as a Republican, whereas Bernie is supposedly this socialist, and Americans don't do socialism. Americans bandy terms around way, way, way too loosely. What they would give for an Eisenhower now, somebody who was prepared across his 8 years to put away his party credentials and to reach out across the aisle to Lyndon Johnson, largely, who was Master of the Senate at the time, to find a way of working that got results. And the first wave of historians looking at Eisenhower just said he was a do-nothing president. And it's absolutely right, because at the height of the Cold War, he did not go to war. 1 American was killed overseas during the Eisenhower presidency in Lebanon, in a peacekeeping operation, quite possibly shot by friendly fire. He waged peace. He didn't do it through angry rhetoric like Donald Trump. He did it by just quietly getting on with the job, by having a bunch of very good people around him, by giving operational management to the people who were experts in the jobs. America needs to fill a lot of very senior civil service roles that they lost during the Trump presidency. They were never filled. They're slowly being backfilled now. We need that caliber of professional politics returned. And there will be some great political figures coming through. It will happen, but they need to be given the space to breathe and to grow and to advance in both parties. And when you have the Democrats in fear of progressives on the left, or Democrats in a red state, like our friend in West Virginia, while they're in fear of just having to hold their own party together, it's difficult for them to move forward. And while the Republicans are enthralled to Donald Trump, their party is in a very bad place. But these things are cyclical, and new people will emerge. We don't know quite yet who they're going to be, but you reeled off a list of very, very good presidents. There have only been a few duffers among them, so maybe we're due a good one next time around.
That seems like a very hopeful way to end the podcast, as we like to do. So that's good to hear. Chris, have you got any final comments that you want to make before we wrap things up?
No, I think that's a perfect and a very hopeful way to end the podcast. So apart from that, Mark, thank you so much.
My pleasure. I love a good rom-com.
Thanks so much, Mark. You're welcome on again anytime. And yeah, it was a real pleasure to have you. Well, I thoroughly enjoyed speaking to Mark and Chris about their respective journeys into academia and postgraduate study, and also our in-depth discussion about American politics. I think Chris was absolutely right when he said that any understanding of modern politics necessarily requires an understanding of America, and also obviously the impact that any future changes in leader and policy in that country will have on the world stage. We hope you found the discussion timely and informative. And until next time, take care.